When I inherited my great-aunt's Victorian house, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. It was the kind of house that people in town whispered about. Its high-pitched roof and intricate wooden trim gave it a certain charm, but the peeling paint and overgrown ivy added a sense of neglect. It was over a century old, and no one had lived there for the last 30 years. My aunt had died in a nursing home, leaving the house to me, a relative she barely knew. I arrived with a sense of adventure, eager to renovate and maybe flip it for a profit. But as I stepped inside for the first time, an unsettling chill greeted me, wrapping itself around me like a damp blanket. The air was thick with the scent of dust and aged wood, and the house groaned as if acknowledging my presence. I chalked it up to being an old building settling, but couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow watching. The first few nights I dismissed the oddities. The house was bound to make noise, right? The creaks, the faint tapping sounds, the draft that sent shivers down my spine even when the windows were shut tight. But one night, as I was unpacking boxes in the dimly lit living room, I noticed a distinct scratching sound coming from the wall to my left. It was rhythmic, deliberate, too consistent to be a mouse or a rat. I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the faded wallpaper. My heart skipped a beat when the scratching paused, only to resume louder, as if it had sensed my curiosity. I quickly pulled back and laughed nervously to myself, blaming the wind or maybe an old pipe. But that night I barely slept. The sound seemed to follow me, growing louder whenever I tried to drift off, almost as if something, or someone, was scratching at the other side of the wall, trying to get out. The next day I called an exterminator. The man who arrived looked around the house, his expression turning grim as he examined the walls with a flashlight. "You've got gaps in your insulation," he muttered. "Probably just the wind getting in, or maybe some old wiring. Nothing to worry about." But as he packed up his tools, he paused, staring at a portrait hanging in the hallway. A painting of a young woman in an old-fashioned dress, her eyes solemn, almost lifelike. "You know the history of this house?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "Not really. My aunt never talked about it." He hesitated. "Houses like these, they collect things, memories, stories, even pain. Sometimes it's best not to dig too deep." With that, he left, leaving me standing there, more unnerved than ever. Over the following days, the scratching intensified. I would move from room to room, and the sound would follow, echoing through the walls like a sinister heartbeat. One evening, desperate for answers, I searched through some of my great-aunt's belongings that had been left in the attic. Among old letters and photographs, I found a leather-bound journal with pages yellowed by time. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor White, the original owner of the house dating back to the early 1900s. Eleanor's entries started innocently enough. She wrote about her excitement at moving into the grand house with her husband, Thomas. But as the pages turned, her writing became more frantic, more disjointed. She described how Thomas grew increasingly possessive, accusing her of being unfaithful, of harboring secrets. He would lock her in the house for days, and Eleanor wrote of feeling watched, even when she was alone. My fingers trembled as I read one of the last entries. "Thomas has gone mad. He speaks of keeping me forever, saying that I belong to him and no one else. I can hear him in the walls at night, whispering to me, scratching at the plaster. He says if I try to leave, he'll make sure I never escape. I don't know how much longer I can stand it. Please, if someone finds this, help me." The entry was dated March 19th, 1903, exactly 121 years ago to the day. My blood ran cold as I realized I was sitting in the very room Eleanor had described, surrounded by the same walls that had once trapped her. My pulse quickened as I heard it again. I leaped up, frantically pulling the furniture away from the walls. I was determined to find the source. Grabbing a hammer, I began to pound against the wall where the noise was loudest, the plaster cracking under each strike until finally a section crumbled, revealing something buried within. It was a painting, embedded deep within the wall like a hidden fresco. It depicted a woman, Eleanor, her eyes wide, filled with terror, her mouth slightly open as if in a silent scream. I stepped back, horrified. As I turned to grab my phone, I felt a rush of cold air, and that's when I heard it. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of breathing coming from inside the wall. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. For a moment, I stood there paralyzed, unable to move. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, I reached out and touched the painting. Beneath my fingers, the surface was damp, almost warm. I jerked my hand back, but it was too late. From deep within the wall, I heard a low, rasping whisper. The days blurred into a fevered nightmare. I barely ate, barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the painted Eleanor, watching me from the walls, her eyes following my every movement. I tried to leave the house to escape, but every time I reached the door, I felt a heaviness in my chest, as if invisible hands were pulling me back, urging me to stay. I dug deeper into Eleanor's journal, desperate for some clue, some way to free her, or myself. And then I found it, an entry scrawled in shaky handwriting, barely legible. He wants to keep me here. He thinks he can trap me in the walls forever. But I've hidden something, a piece of him. If you find it, maybe you can end this. I spent hours tearing apart the house, ripping up floorboards, prying open old cabinets, until, in the dark, narrow space between two beams, I found it. A small, tarnished locket. Inside was a photograph of Eleanor and Thomas, smiling. But as I stared at it, something shifted in the image. Thomas's smile twisted, growing wider, more grotesque, and Eleanor's eyes, they seemed to dart toward me, pleading. I heard the scratching again, more frenzied, more desperate than ever. I could feel the walls trembling around me as I clutched the locket, my mind racing. And then the realization hit me. This house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Thomas had found a way to trap Eleanor, to bind her spirit to the walls. And now, he wanted me too. In a frenzy, I grabbed the hammer and smashed the locket, crushing it under my heel until the glass shattered. The house shook violently, the walls groaning as if in pain, and the scratching. Oh God, the scratching. It reached a deafening pitch before. Suddenly it stopped. I stood there in silence, my breath ragged, the house around me eerily still. I waited, half expecting to hear that familiar sound, but there was nothing. I stumbled to the door, my legs weak, and stepped outside. For the first time in weeks, the air felt clean, free. I never went back. I sold the house to a demolition company, warning them that it was unsafe, that it needed to be torn down. But sometimes, late at night, as I lie in bed, I swear I can still hear it. And I wonder, did I really escape? Or is he still watching? I thought I had left it all behind, I really did. It's been 6 months since I fled that house, and I'd convinced myself that I was free. But freedom was an illusion. Even hundreds of miles away in a cramped apartment in the city, I could still feel it. The creeping sensation that something was watching me. It was subtle at first, just the occasional shadow flickering at the corner of my vision, or the low hum of static when I turned on the TV. But it was there, waiting. I tried to move on, to rebuild my life, but every night it came back to me. The dream. I would find myself standing in front of that damned house again, the windows dark, the ivy crawling up its sides like veins on decaying skin. And always, I could hear it. The scratching. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the phantom sound echoing in my ears long after I'd woken. My friends told me it was trauma, that I was suffering from PTSD, but I knew it was something more, something that refused to let go. One night, as I sat in my tiny apartment, staring blankly at my laptop screen, a notification popped up. It was an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You can't escape her." My heart sank. With trembling hands, I opened it. The message contained only a single attachment, a black and white photograph. It was grainy, old, but unmistakable. It was the portrait of Eleanor, the same haunting image I had found buried in the walls, her eyes hollow and lifeless, staring straight through the screen and into my soul. Suddenly, the scratching returned, louder than ever. But this time, it wasn't just in my head. I heard it coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned, and there it was, etched into the paint of my apartment wall, tiny grooves forming a crude message. "Help me." I stumbled backward, tripping over my chair, heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't possible. I had left that house. I had destroyed the locket. How could it still be happening? And then it hit me. I hadn't freed Eleanor. I had only made it worse. Whatever bound her to that place was now following me, desperately clinging on, pleading for release. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go back. I drove through the night, the highway stretching endlessly before me, each mile feeling like I was traveling deeper into a nightmare. When I finally reached the house, I was surprised to find it still standing. The demolition company hadn't touched it. It loomed against the moonlit sky, even more decrepit than before, as if it had aged 100 years since I'd last seen it. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to approach the front door. It creaked open, and the smell of rot and mildew hit me like a wall. I hesitated, but then I heard it. I followed the sound, my feet moving of their own accord, leading me up the staircase to the second floor, down the hallway, to the door of the room where I had first discovered the painting. It was wide open, and beyond it, the room was exactly as I had left it, except now, there was something new. In the center of the room stood an antique mirror, tall and ornate, its frame covered in delicate carvings of twisted, interwoven vines. It hadn't been there before. As I stepped closer, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The mirror's surface was cloudy, like fogged glass, but as I stared into it, I could make out a faint reflection. It was Eleanor. Her face was twisted in anguish, her lips moving silently, mouthing the same words over and over again. "Help me. Help me." But what could I do? How could I fight something that wasn't even alive? As I stood there, paralyzed, the air grew colder, and the scratching began again, more frantic, more desperate. I looked down and saw that my own reflection had joined in, fingers digging into the glass from the inside, leaving deep gouges in the surface. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I screamed, smashing my fist into the mirror. The glass shattered, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Then, the mirror exploded, sending shards flying in every direction. I fell backward, shielding my face as the room was bathed in darkness. Slowly, I opened my eyes, and that's when I saw her. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, no longer a reflection, but real, solid. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw something other than fear. There was a spark of recognition, a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, and as she spoke, her form began to dissolve, breaking apart into particles of light. But before she disappeared completely, her gaze shifted to something behind me. I turned and felt my blood turn to ice. There, in the shadows, stood a man. He was tall, with dark, empty eyes, and his face was twisted into a cruel, mocking grin. Thomas. the man who had trapped her here, who had bound her spirit to this house. And now he was free. The walls began to shake, the wood groaning as if the house itself was awakening. I stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut in my face, trapping me inside. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I could feel something cold and wet wrapping around my ankles, dragging me toward the center of the room. Desperately, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a shard of the mirror, still slick with blood. I slashed at the darkness, and for a moment, it recoiled, shrieking in pain. I didn't stop. I slashed again and again until I felt something give way, and the room erupted in a blinding flash of light. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor, the morning sun streaming through a crack in the boarded-up window. The house was silent. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding, and ran for the door. This time, it opened without resistance. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I drove until I couldn't see the house anymore, until it was nothing more than a distant memory. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. In my rearview mirror, for just a moment, I saw them. Eleanor and Thomas standing side by side, watching me leave. The email arrived later that night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. The same address, the same subject line. But this time, the attachment was different. It was a video filmed in shaky handheld footage of someone standing in front of the house, just like I had been. As the camera panned upward, I could see a figure in the window, staring down at me. It was my own reflection, and from inside the walls, I heard it.